Hi Guy, welcome back TV spoilers. That day, the executive office at Newman Enterprises carried a metallic weight in the air cold, bright, and unforgiving as if every sheet of glass and every polished edge in the room were reflecting a truth no one wanted to name. Outside those doors, the company still moved on the momentum of habit and loyalty, but inside, something had already crossed a point of no return. Nick didn't come to argue for pride, and he didn't come to salvage a relationship that had been eroded by years of doubt. He came to cut the rope that was tightening around Newman Enterprises' throat. Sharon walked in beside him with a calm that wasn't softness but survival and earned steadiness. That comes from watching a family fracture too many times and knowing that if the cracks spread any further, the whole structure would collapse without the enemy even needing to strike. They entered with an unspoken agreement. Today, they would not let Phyllis slip away behind clever detours or the kind of swagger that had helped her outlast every crisis before. Phyllis was already there, positioned near the desk like someone who understood the power of occupying the center of the room. It was a familiar strategy: plant yourself in the spotlight, so everyone else is forced to orbit around you. Her face showed no panic, almost a trace of pride, as if being suspected were merely another scene she'd played 1,000 times and memorized to perfection. Yet her eyes held a flicker of something tighter, sharper, caution as thin as a strand of hair. It wasn't that she feared Nick or Sharon. She feared what she could no longer guarantee she still controlled. For too long she had lived by controlling the narrative, ending perception, steering blame, making other people believe the truth was something pliable. And with the company sliding into crisis like a ship losing its rudder, Phyllis knew that this time, if someone decided to pin the disaster on her, she might not have enough time to twist the story into safety. Nick began with a restraint that was more frightening than anger, the kind that appears only after a person has moved beyond heat and into the coldest part of a decision. He didn't arrive with chaotic insults or impulsive shouting. He laid each thought on the table like shards of glass, harp, clear, impossible to ignore. He accused Phyllis of being one of the central reasons Newman Enterprises was spiraling, not through petty personal grievances but by tying her actions directly to the company's decline. In the way Nick looked at her was a deep disappointment. The disappointment of someone who once believed that no matter how reckless Phyllis could be, she understood the line she couldn't cross when the family's future and the company's survival were at stake. Now Nick wasn't sure that line still existed for her. Phyllis reacted instantly, on instinct. She denied everything with the fierce certainty she'd always used as armor, denying as though denial itself were the last tool left to keep her upright. But she didn't stop there. She pivoted, turning the blade toward Victor, invoking his recent decisions as a chain of misjudgments that had weakened the company. Phyllis knew how to redirect a story. If she could force Nick and Sharon to focus on Victor, if she could make them believe the rot began at the very top, she could create a gray zone wide enough to disappear inside. For a brief moment, she seemed to catch the rhythm of the room, pulling it into an argument about leadership and strategy instead of motive and moral consequence. Sharon refused to let that happen. Sharon didn't attack with impulsive fury, she cut with experience. She looked at Phyllis the way someone looks at a wound that keeps reopening each time deeper, because no one has ever stitched it properly. Sharon acknowledged what might be true. Yes, Victor had made choices that left Newman Enterprises exposed. But Sharon drew a hard line between mistakes and sabotage, between flawed leadership and deliberate manipulation from within. They weren't there to debate whether Victor was wrong. They were there to ask what Phyllis had done, how far she had gone, and why everything had exploded in ways no one could contain. Sharon didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm alone was enough to put hairline fractures into Phyllis's defenses. That was when Nick brought out what he and Sharon had carried into the room, like a blade sharpened for a single moment. He didn't toss it out as a threat. He placed it between them with surgical precision, an old email from Victor to Phyllis. The instant that proof appeared, the atmosphere changed with the click of a lock turning. What had been an accusation that could be dismissed as personal bias became something with fingerprints, intent, and undeniable structure. The email contained a secret directive tied to Kane Ashby. It showed that Victor had once assigned Phyllis an undercover mission to undermine Kane from inside Newman Enterprises, not with open attacks, but by pushing Kane into mistakes, forcing cracks in his credibility, ensuring he lost footing before he could build anything stable. In that moment, Phyllis froze as if caught in an unplanned photograph. She tried to keep her face still, but her eyes betrayed her first. Anger flashed, then fear, then calculation like headlights cutting across a dark road. She understood how dangerous this was. Not only because it proved she had accepted a covert assignment, but because it proved she had hidden it, carried it as part of her work. And now it was being dragged into the open at the exact moment. Newman Enterprises was already burning. Nick didn't need to explain. The email spoke for him, and its existence instantly cast every one of Phyllis's defenses under a harsher light. If she had taken the directive, if she had participated in undermining Kane, then every recent shift, every internal rupture, every crisis could be traced back to her as part of a chain reaction. Phyllis recognized it too, and she struck back with the only argument she thought could still protect her. She had been following Victor's orders, she had been acting in the Newman family's best interests. She tried to frame herself as a soldier executing a command, not a rogue agent twisting the knife on her own. She tried to wrap herself in the language of sacrificial protection, same language Victor often used to justify brutality. But Sharon didn't yield. Sharon pointed out that Phyllis had crossed a boundary, that there was a difference between carrying out an order to protect Newman Enterprises and driving the situation so far into chaos that no one could control it anymore. Sharon's stare held something heavier than personal rivalry, it carried responsibility. Sharon understood what it felt like to be pulled into Victor's power games, to be told to accept silence for the greater good. She also understood the cost of that silence. It corrodes integrity, turns people into tools, and eventually turns a family into a battlefield. Sharon wasn't speaking from bitterness. She was speaking from the exhausted clarity of someone who had watched this pattern destroy too much already. Phyllis's anger rose, and it wasn't performative this time. It was the real response of someone cornered. She snapped back, insisting Victor had built the entire system, that everyone knew Victor used people like chess pieces. She wanted Nick and Sharon to admit they had lived in that system too, benefited from it, looked away when Victor crossed lines because it made them feel safe. Phyllis tried to drag them down with her, to turn this confrontation into a trial of collective guilt where no one was clean enough to judge. It was an old tactic. If everyone is guilty, then her guilt feels lighter. Nick didn't come to debate who was clean. He came to demand one specific truth: how deep was Phyllis involved in the current collapse? And what were her real motives? Nick and Sharon pressed her to answer clearly, not with diversion and wordplay but with the stripped-down reality. Nick looked at Phyllis like someone who had stepped over too many lines, and still believed she could return whenever she chose. Nick didn't believe that anymore. He needed to know where she had stopped or whether she had never stopped at all. The pressure in the room didn't require shouting to suffocate, because what Nick and Sharon were doing wasn't merely demanding answers. They were stripping away the one thing Phyllis had always guarded: control over how others saw her. They weren't letting her choose the most convenient version of the truth. They weren't letting her shape herself into a victim or a hero. They pinned her under the white, cold glare of evidence and accountability. Phyllis held on, but the steadiness she performed began to fracture. She insisted she had only followed Victor's orders, that her assignment was to undermine Kane from within to protect the company from a threat Victor believed was real. The way she clung to that justification made it clear she had repeated it to herself for a long time. When someone does the wrong thing long enough, they build a philosophy sturdy enough to live inside. Phyllis had done that. She had turned a covert directive into work for the family, into duty. But the longer she spoke, the clearer another truth became: she hadn't done it only for Victor. She had done it for herself as well. And then, when Nick and Sharon closed in, Phyllis admitted the part she could no longer deny. She admitted she had taken advantage of the opportunity to push Kane even farther out. That was the truth at the deepest layer. When Victor gave the order, Phyllis didn't see only a command, she saw an opening. An opening to prove she was indispensable, to secure a position inside Newman Enterprises that no one could replace, to become someone Victor had to rely on. An opening to strengthen her own influence by ensuring a potential rival, like Kane, could never stabilize. In the Newman world, opportunity is addictive. It convinces people that one more step, one more move will give them control. Phyllis stepped forward again and again until she realized the ground beneath her wasn't solid anymore. She admitted the current situation had slipped beyond her control. Those words, short as they were, landed like a confession, because they implied actions had been taken, consequences set in motion, and now no one knew how to stop what was coming. They also implied that if Newman Enterprises was collapsing, it wasn't a single accident, it was the outcome of a chain of choices. And Phyllis had been an active link in that chain. Sharon felt a chill at that admission, not because she was surprised Phyllis could go that far, but because she understood what out of control meant inside Newman Enterprises. It meant secrets buried for too long would start digging themselves up. It meant people who once trusted each other would begin watching each other like enemies. It meant the family would be torn apart by the very schemes they once believed kept them safe. Sharon didn't need to say it aloud, it was already visible in Nick's face, in the way his jaw set. In the distance he put between himself and Phyllis as if closeness would weaken him. Nick felt a different kind of betrayal. If he had survived betrayals of the heart, this was the betrayal of principle. He could forgive personal failure. He struggled to forgive someone who claimed she was acting for the family while igniting a crisis that threatened to drag them all down. Nick knew Victor could be ruthless, but Victor always believed he could control the fallout. Phyllis couldn't. And Phyllis's admission that she had lost control turned her into something Nick saw as danger, no longer a person he could negotiate with. Phyllis, under their pressure, revealed a kind of desperation she hated to show. Not desperation at being exposed, but desperation at being forced to look at the damage. She could tolerate being hated, suspected, isolated. She had always paid that price to survive among powerful people. What she could not tolerate was the possibility that she had truly ruined the very thing she kept insisting she was protecting. She clung to the idea that Victor created the system, that she was merely a player inside it. Even as she clung to Victor like a lifeline, she knew that lifeline could be cut at any moment. And that was her deepest fear. Nick and Sharon's accusations. But Victor deciding she had failed and discarding her as a broken piece. That unexpected proof shifted the entire landscape, not simply because it exposed a covert mission, but because it forced Nick and Sharon to stop pretending any of this was misunderstanding. It turned everything concrete. It made responsibility visible. And it made the fractures in the Newman family impossible to deny. Sharon looked at Nick and saw him facing a decision he could no longer postpone. Remain loyal to the power structure Victor had built, or protect Newman Enterprises by cutting away what had begun to rot it from the inside. Nick looked at Sharon and saw the firm resolve of someone who refused to accept the old excuses anymore. Both of them understood that once this email existed in the open, it wouldn't end here. And silence would only make the disaster larger. Phyllis felt the ground falling away under her. She could try to keep blaming Victor, but it wasn't enough anymore. She could keep insisting the mission was only to take down Kane. But that made a darker question inevitable. If Victor could order this, how many other directives had existed? And how many other people had been pulled into similar shadows? She could try to convince Nick she still had insider knowledge, that she could help fix what she helped break. But Nick hadn't come seeking help, he had come demanding accountability. In the final stretch of the confrontation, the room fell silent in a way that was more terrifying than any scream. Nick stopped talking. Sharon didn't add another word. They let the truth sit there, cold and undeniable, something no one could cover up again. Phyllis stood between them, feeling every exit narrowing to nothing. She understood that from this point on, everything she had built at Newman Enterprises would be reevaluated through suspicion. Every decision, every recommendation, every move she had shielded behind the phrase for the family, and worse. She understood that Kane Ashby, wherever he was in the wider game, would no longer remain a distant target. He would become the center of the storm once the secret directive was exposed. Nick glanced down at the email one more time, as if making sure he hadn't missed anything. And that was when a small detail dropped the temperature of the room even further. Not a new character, not a new event, but a trace embedded inside the proof itself. The message chain didn't end with the directive to sabotage Kane. It continued. A thread extended downward, a scroll that implied more orders, more consequences, an entire deeper layer that no one had spoken aloud yet. Nick's gaze tightened as he realized the email wasn't a single instruction. It was a door cracked open into something far worse. Sharon noticed the shift in his expression and understood instantly. There was still something under the surface that Phyllis hadn't confessed. Phyllis caught that look in for the first time during the confrontation. Her confidence truly faltered because she knew Nick had just seen what she had tried hardest to keep buried. And if he scrolled even one line farther, this would no longer be only about Newman Enterprises collapsing or Kane being undermined. It would be about a truth powerful enough to drown everything they were still trying to hold together. The office at Newman Enterprises that day felt like a sealed box packed with static. The kind of charged silence where even a single blink at the wrong moment could spark a fire. It wasn't because anyone lacked professionalism, it was because everyone was forcing themselves to look composed while something inside the company had been cracking for a long time. The AI scandal was no longer an abstract phrase for headlines. It clung to the air in every corridor, every meeting, every polite greeting that died halfway under a wary stare. Nick walked in with an unusual intensity, the kind that comes when someone has been pushed to the edge of endurance and refuses to accept one more explanation. Sharon followed beside him, not loud but razor-focused. carrying a calm that felt more dangerous than anger because it meant she had thought this through, weighed it carefully, and didn't come to negotiate her emotions. They shared one purpose: to force Phyllis to face her role in the AI disaster, shaking Newman to its foundations and collapsing trust inside the family. Like rotten bricks giving way at the first touch, Phyllis didn't sit and wait like someone being questioned. She stood, keeping just enough distance to avoid looking cornered and just enough control to pivot if the room turned against her. The strange part was that she didn't look panicked. She looked like someone who had always known this moment would come, only she didn't know exactly what shape it would take. In the past, Phyllis could rely on her sharp instincts to turn tension into a battle of words and ego. But this time the air was too heavy for games. Nick and Sharon weren't here to be dragged into her whirlpool of deflection. They came with evidence, with conclusions, with a kind of accumulated exhaustion that makes anyone more ruthless about demanding the truth. Nick drove straight into the heart of the AI scandal: the data, the connections, the traces that had detonated inside Newman and forced every recent decision under suspicion. He didn't need to exaggerate. Reality was already brutal enough. There was something in his eyes that looked like a wound after the last bandage has been ripped away, and it pushed him toward the instinct of survival: identify the source of infection, cut it out, and save what's left before the whole body goes under. Sharon stood beside him, constantly keeping the confrontation from collapsing into blind explosion. But she wasn't soft either. She looked at Phyllis with the stare of someone who has heard too many justified reasons and understands that reasons don't erase consequences. For Sharon, it wasn't simply about right or wrong. It was about the fact that Newman Enterprises was already at the edge, and every shadowy move now felt like pouring gasoline into a locked room. Phyllis listened to the accusations, and the first thing that surged up was outrage. Not the staged outrage of a convenient defense, but the raw frustration of being boxed in by people she believed were framing her inside a single picture: the saboteur, the destroyer, the woman who would sell anything for advantage. She struck back almost immediately with a decisiveness so sharp it made the room tilt, as if someone had slammed a fist on the desk even though no sound was made. She didn't deny the existence of a power. Gamesh denied Nick and Sharon's definition of that game. In Phyllis's view, they weren't outsiders with a clear view. They were being pulled without knowing it, controlled while still believing they were free. And the hand on the strings, she insisted, belonged to Victor Newman. That accusation cut through the space like a cold blade, because it hit the one truth Nick and Sharon hated to admit: no matter how grown, independent, or defiant they became, they still lived inside Victor's orbit. Phyllis spoke with anger, but underneath it was a desperation she tried to keep buried: the desperation of someone who understands the cost of standing too close to Victor and understands that when Victor wants someone removed from the board, he doesn't have to strike directly. He only has to make them trap themselves inside their own choices. Phyllis looked at Nick and Sharon like two people trying to do the right thing, while aiming at the wrong target. She insisted they were being manipulated in plain sight, that their fury was being guided to land on her, while the person who deserved the hardest questions sat at the top, calm and untouched, as if he had never left a fingerprint. Then Phyllis dropped the truth that made the room harder to breathe. Victor had warned her. Coming from her, that word didn't mean a casual reminder, it implied pressure, command, and an unspoken threat that didn't need to be spelled out. She revealed that Victor had forced her to steal a dangerous AI program to use against Kane Ashby. This wasn't a small deception or a test move. It was an act capable of triggering a chain reaction even the smartest strategist might not be able to contain. Phyllis didn't try to paint herself as purely innocent. She spoke like someone acknowledging the brutal rules of Victor's world: either you comply, or you get crushed. In that moment, she chose survival. What made it truly frightening was that Phyllis didn't describe Victor as a man simply angry at Kane. She described him as a mind building plans that were complex and unpredictable, far beyond what anyone understood. Victor didn't just want to win a clash, wanted to end the game in a way that left his opponent unable to stand again. Phyllis stressed that this wasn't a simple counterattack. It was a campaign, a network of strategies, where AI wasn't just a tool but a double-edged blade that could slice anyone if Victor decided it was necessary. As she said it, her eyes flashed with a moment of genuine unease, as if even she feared what she had helped touch, feared the realization that she had held something too powerful and had no idea when it might explode. Phyllis called herself a pawn in Victor's larger game to completely bring down Kane Ashby. The phrase sounded bitter and ruthless, like she was reminding herself not to romanticize her importance, because in that board game no one was untouchable. Yet that admission made her argument harder to dismiss, because Phyllis wasn't the type to belittle herself unless she had to. If she was willing to describe herself as a pawn, It meant she was clinging to the only thing that might keep her from being destroyed, the truth that she wasn't writing the rules, was being forced to play by them. Nick and Sharon were shaken, and that quiet shake was terrifying in its own way. They weren't shaken because they trusted Phyllis blindly. They were shaken because they realized the picture might be larger and darker than what they had prepared themselves to face. Deep down, Nick always wanted to believe that Victor, however ruthless, still had boundaries. That he did what he did for a twisted version of protecting the family. But when Phyllis placed AI at the center of an operation tied to destroying Kane, Nick began to feel a truth he didn't want. Victor may have stepped into a new kind of darkness, where protection wasn't a reason anymore, only a polished name for absolute control. Nick felt betrayed not just by actions but by the idea that his father might be willing to turn the company's future into a battlefield, just to secure the final victory. Sharon felt it too. She understood Victor better than most people, not because she was close to him, but because she had watched how he applied pressure and built narratives. Sharon often saw the world through a survival instinct, recognized the signs before the disaster hits. Right now, that instinct flared like an alarm. If Victor truly forced Phyllis to steal a dangerous AI program, the question was no longer only what Phyllis had done, it was what Victor had planned next. Sharon sensed a painful truth: she and Nick might be trapped inside a war where they were only shown the surface, while the deeper machinery was being run by someone who never accepts defeat. Doubt about Victor's motives began to spread, not loudly but persistently, like ink bleeding into paper until it can't be erased. The tension rose not because voices got louder, but because every sentence Phyllis spoke rattled the foundation Nick and Sharon stood on. If she was telling the truth, then they were pouring their anger onto a pawn pushed into position, while the true player stood back and watched them destroy each other. If she was lying, then she was desperate enough to invent a version of Victor to save herself in that would make her even more dangerous. Either way, Nick and Sharon were trapped in an ugly choice: keep trusting their instinct that Phyllis is the problem, or begin questioning Victor directly. The one move every Newman avoids because it forces them to face a terrifying possibility. This family might be able to destroy itself from the inside without any outside enemy. Phyllis saw that hesitation, and she grabbed it like someone drowning who suddenly finds a piece of wood. She challenged Nick and Sharon to look deeper into Victor instead of condemning her for trying to survive in his game. Her challenge didn't need to be shouted, the force of it was like a shove. If they were willing to call her a destroyer, then they should be willing to name the person who placed her in that role. Phyllis didn't beg for forgiveness because she knew it was pointless. She only wanted to shift the confrontation from "what did you do?" to "who is really pulling the strings." She wanted them to understand that she might be wrong. She might have crossed lines. She might have turned a mission into an opportunity for herself. But she wasn't the only reason Newman Enterprises was bleeding. In Phyllis's mind, if she was going down, she would drag Victor's truth down with her, if only to prove she wasn't falling alone. Nick felt a savage inner tug of war. He hated the way Phyllis always found a way to survive by throwing darkness onto someone else. But he couldn't deny that years of living near Victor had taught him that every plan his father made had layers and rarely stopped at a simple goal. Nick wanted to preserve the image of Victor as a man who could be harsh, but ultimately chose the family because if that image collapsed, Nick would be forced to face a hollow space inside his own identity. Who was he? If the father he feared and respected was also the source of the disaster? Sharon watched Nick and saw a real internal battle forming between loyalty and the fear that loyalty itself was being used. Sharon also wondered if she was witnessing a defining moment. The moment Nick would be forced to confront Victor as a real man, not a symbol, not an untouchable pillar. Inside that office, Phyllis wasn't only fighting to protect herself. She was fighting to force them to look at the system that had swallowed all of them. And the cruelest part was that even if Phyllis was blameworthy, her words carried weight because they hid a truth everyone had touched before. Victor never plays a small game. He sets a target and is willing to use anyone to reach it. If Kane is the target, then every piece around him can be moved, sacrificed, or shattered depending on what Victor needs. I was simply a new tool inside an old arsenal, power and control. And when technology falls into the hands of someone like Victor, it stops being progress. It becomes fuel. By the end of the confrontation, none of the three left the room feeling victorious. Nick and Sharon couldn't instantly absolve Phyllis because she had still participated, still gotten her hands dirty, and the consequences were still crushing Newman Enterprises. But they also couldn't return to the simple certainty that Phyllis was the only root of the rot. Phyllis, despite her fierce counterattack, wasn't relieved either. She had only bought herself a small breath by unleashing a larger, more dangerous truth. The air in the room felt like the moment before a storm breaks, heavy, silent. full of signs that one more touch could bring the whole ceiling down. Sharon kept her calm, but a new fear had already formed inside her if Victor was truly running a deeper plan. Then who among them had been marked as the piece that must fall to protect the rest? Nick didn't speak much, but the look in his eyes suggested a decision-taking champion that could shatter the family's long habit of silence. And as someone watching this story unfold, I'll admit there's always something chilling about hearing a character say they were just trying to survive in the world of Y&R. Survival is rarely innocent. It's usually the doorway into a new cycle of betrayal and self-destructs. I feel both sympathy and dread when I think of Nick and Sharon. They walked in searching for the person who caused the disaster, but they may be forced to face the truth that the disaster could have begun with the very man they call family. And Phyllis flawed, guilty. Infuriating till makes me feel like I'm watching someone sprint through a maze designed by someone else while being told she must carry the blame for the maze's existence. The real pain here isn't only the AI scandal. It's the question of trust when you start doubting the people closest to you. What do you have left to hold onto? Just as the tension seemed to peak, Phyllis looked straight at Nick and Sharon with an all-or-nothing stare and insisted that, if they truly wanted to save Newman Enterprises, they would have to look at Victor. In that moment, Nick's expression lost its certainty. He looked like someone who had just heard a door open behind him and couldn't tell whether it led to escape or a cliff. Sharon recognized the shift instantly, and that shift created the hook that sends a cold rush through the spine. If Nick and Sharon decide to chase the truth all the way back to Victor, what they uncover may not only destroy Phyllis, it may ignite Newman Enterprises and the Newman family in a way no one can stop. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.